Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Let's Make a Better World. I'm your host, David Tier, and I haven't made a video on this channel, I think, for a few weeks. I noticed that I'm getting a lot of traffic on this channel now. For the last couple of weeks, I think mainly because of, the news about the Epstein files and how Trump won't disclose his involvement with Epstein and his illegal, ring of young women. But anyway, let's just begin this. Before I begin, I just want to say that I wrote a speech a few days ago, which I'm going to give on this channel. It's pretty long. It might take about a half an hour or so. But what I'm going to talk about is the downfall of democracy in the USA. And it's not just what Trump has done wrong. It's also where I think we started going wrong as a country. And I think most of this started about 50 years ago, mostly with Reagan. And it's just gotten worse and worse ever since. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The downfall of democracy in the USA. So anyway, here it goes. I'll just pull it up here. Um, so, for most of my life, I've been a proud American citizen, and the main thing I've been proud of is our government and our democracy. Nearly 250 years ago, our founding fathers created the first successful democracy of its kind, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Although this democracy has been seriously compromised at various times in our history, I'd say that for the most part it has worked quite well until now. Now, like most Americans, as well as most people around the world, I see President Donald J. Trump as the most serious threat to our democracy in our entire nation's history. By his own words, Trump does not respect our Constitution or our democracy and wants to be our first king. Well, guess what, Mr. Trump? Most Americans don't feel this way at all, myself included. Although we've had our share of bad presidents, you take the cake. At least every other president we've ever had believed in our Constitution as well as our democracy, but clearly you do not, which makes you completely unqualified to be commander-in-chief and leader of the free world. With all that said, how in the hell did we ever get to this point? I see Trump as the pinnacle of a gradual pattern of undoing of our democracy during the past 50 years or so, mainly starting with President Reagan, who was elected in 1980 when I was just 18 years old. Unfortunately, I voted for Reagan myself, a decision I regretted for most of my life since, but this was the first time I ever voted, and like most Americans at the time, I saw Reagan as the lesser of two evils, since Carter seemed so incompetent to me at the time, with the Iranian hostage crisis and double-digit inflation, the latter of which I saw him as being responsible. But in retrospect, I'd say that until that point in my life, our government, including our presidency, had been working quite well. Sure, we had our share of problems, like the Vietnam War, Watergate, the energy crisis, and the economic recession of the 70s, but at least our government was helping our people at the time, with welfare, public education and transportation, and our space program, which had even gotten us to the moon. During the 60s and 70s, free speech was also working quite well at shaping our society. The huge anti-war demonstrations of the 60s and 70s eventually led to the end of the Vietnam War. What's more, various forms of human rights, like civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and even animal rights, made our society much more tolerant and humane. Then in 1981, along came Reagan, and what happened? All of a sudden, government programs started getting cut. Reagan fired air traffic controllers, deregulated utilities, and closed mental facilities, leading to a huge rise in homelessness, as well as more and more corporate control. This was the beginning of what President Eisenhower, a Republican, by the way, had feared and even tried to warn us against about during the 1950s, namely the control of our country by our military-industrial complex. Although many Americans considered Reagan to be one of our greatest presidents, and I voted for him myself, by the end of his first term, I no longer felt this way. I voted for Mondale in 1984, and I voted Democrat in every presidential election since, except in 2000 when I didn't vote due to personal circumstances. During Reagan's second term, I became politically active. I joined several left-wing political groups in Chicago, where I was living at the time, and even participated in 2 demonstrations, one in 1986 in downtown Chicago for peace, jobs, and justice, with around 10,000 participants, and a much bigger one the following year in Washington, D.C., against apartheid as well as U.S. involvement in Central America, with some 100,000 participants. I'm really glad I participated in both of these marches, and I feel that in a very small way I made a big positive impact, especially regarding helping to bring about the end of apartheid. The 90s seemed hopeful with Bill Clinton as president, and in many important ways I'd say our country improved during this decade. However, due to rising corporate control, the power of our government was severely limited, resulting in the unexpected takeover of Congress by the Republican Party in 1994, who blocked nearly every bill President Clinton tried to pass and even shut down the government twice. What's more, they were able to get Clinton impeached over his affair with Monica Lewinsky, which most Americans, including myself, felt had no bearing on his leadership ability. What's more, although America became more productive in many ways during the 90s, we were still experiencing more and more corporate control as well as more division between rich and poor. Although many things had seemed hopeful by the beginning of the new millennium, shortly thereafter, the shit really began to hit the fan. For starters, the year 2000 saw the highly controversial victory of President George W. Bush over Al Gore by just 4 electoral votes, though it seemed pretty obvious to me as well as to many other Americans that this election had been rigged in Florida, where W won all of its 27 electoral votes due to just a few hundred more popular votes in that state, most likely due to misleading butterfly ballots. Less than a year later, the world became face to face with 9/11, the worst terrorist attack ever against the USA, in which some 3,000 innocent American civilians were killed. Although this was certainly horrible, the aftermath was much more horrible. It led to a 20-year-long war on terrorism, the longest in our nation's history, which was mainly an excuse for unjust American attacks on the Middle East, especially W's unconstitutional invasion of Iraq in 2003, his excuse being that their government had been hiding weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. To make matters worse, he was re-elected in 2004, and this time he even won the popular vote as well. A lot of turmoil continued during the new millennium, including devastating natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed half of New Orleans, as well as horrible wildfires in California, the likes of which had never been seen before. Amidst all this, as well as scientific evidence for various forms of climate change and destruction of various ecosystems throughout the world, so-called scientists hired by large corporations and the GOP continue to tell their lies that it was a hoax, and that everything we've been experiencing was just part of a natural cycle. Meanwhile, SUVs remain popular throughout the country, mainly occupied by just one person, while much of the country, including Southern California where I lived, required the use of cars for transportation, since public transportation there, as well as many other parts of the country, were unreliable. The next big national crisis was the 2008 housing and banking crisis, triggered by greedy investors and shorts, as well as banks that offered low mortgages to new homeowners, many of whom couldn't afford to pay them off and thus had them foreclosed. Clearly, things were getting pretty bad. With 2009 came a sense of hope again with President Obama. Although I think he was a good president overall, I never liked him as much as Clinton, mainly for two reasons. For starters, although Obama was determined to fix our broken healthcare system, I always felt that Obamacare didn't do enough. Sure, he made sure Americans got health insurance, but he made them pay for it themselves, and he didn't do nearly enough to fix the problem, which was and still is privatized medicine for profit instead of universal health care, which the rest of the developed world has enjoyed since the end of World War II. As if this weren't bad enough, along came 2017, which in nobody's expectations brought us President Trump. Like many Americans, I was shocked that he won. Besides his opponent, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more popular votes. So the problem seemed to be the Electoral College was rigged toward the Republican Party, who now controlled the so-called red states, the primarily rural states in the middle of the country, whose populations were generally smaller than the democratically held blue states like California and New York, which carry less weight since every state automatically gets an additional 2 extra electoral votes favoring the smaller states, i.e. the red states. I couldn't believe that Trump was now president. Although I'd enjoyed watching him on a full season of The Apprentice in 2006, and had come to think of him as a shrewd businessman, I also thought of him as a horrible bully and definitely not someone fit for the job of commander-in-chief. I knew right from the beginning that we were in for hard times with Trump, and as an expression of my discontent, I marched against him twice in downtown San Diego, and in both demonstrations, each of which had about 100,000 participants, I witnessed nothing but support from bypassers, including the police. Throughout Trump's first term, I was appalled by his various forms of incompetence, especially the way he dealt with COVID-19, a new epidemic, which began infecting people worldwide early in 2020 and quickly spread like wildfire. Like everyone else, I did what I could to protect myself and everyone else by wearing a mask and latex glove whenever I went outside. I also stocked up my pantry with as many paper products and dry foods as I could. Due to adequate preparations, I managed not to become infected all the way up to 2021 when the first vaccine became available. What appalled me about Trump in 2020 was that he took absolutely no responsibility for protecting Americans from this menacing plague, which ended up killing over 1 million Americans and 7 million people worldwide. Trump even told his supporters not to wear masks, and he didn't either, telling us that it would go away on its own. I really think that COVID-19 was the main reason that Trump lost to Biden in 2020, and that despite his other horrible debauches, like his insistence on building a wall around the border with Mexico, of which only about 2% got built, as well as deporting millions of illegals and splitting up their families, his impeachment for his illegal involvement with Putin, not to mention his refusal to release his income tax records. Then came January 6, 2021, a date that will remain in infamy in American history, namely the day Trump instigated a riot of hundreds of angry mobsters against the U.S. Capitol in protest of his loss of the election. Like most Americans, I was utterly in shock. Never before in our nation's history had anything like this ever happened. All 36 of our previous transfers of presidential power had occurred peacefully, each president respectfully allowing the next one to come in. But not Trump. 5 people were even killed by the angry mob. Once Biden came in, I felt a strong sense of relief as well as pride once again in our presidency. Like millions of other Americans, I watched his inauguration on TV. I was quite moved by his dedication to our Constitution, unlike his predecessor. I was also very pleased by how he began his term, first making sure that all Americans were able to get vaccinated against COVID-19, and even doing his best to vaccinate as many people as possible overseas, by shipping large quantities of vaccine to India and other places where it was needed. Furthermore, I was very pleased with how Biden handled Putin's 2022 attack on Ukraine by imposing sanctions on oil from Russia, an unfortunate consequence of which was higher gas prices, leading to a new wave of inflation. But unlike many other Americans who are apt to blame Biden for inflation without knowing all the circumstances, I did not. During 2023 and 2024, although I was quite concerned by various ways in which the USA had been going downhill, nevertheless I had confidence in Biden and felt that we were generally moving in the right direction. Nevertheless, by the summer of 2024, I became concerned that he was generally perceived as being too old to remain president for another term and would thus most likely lose if he ran against Trump. Thus, I was very pleased when he decided to step down and let Vice President Kamala Harris run for president. Although I didn't know too much about her when she was VP, once she got in the race, I decided to research her. I quickly learned that she had been an excellent student at Oakland, California, where she grew up, received a law degree from a very prestigious college, became a successful DA, brought many violent criminals to justice while easing up on nonviolent criminals, and worked with Mexico to bring in immigrants legally and deport those who had come in illegally, and without the need for a wall. I was quite impressed when I learned all this about her and felt she would make a great president, regardless of her gender or ethnicity. As a result, I spent a month doing volunteer work to help her campaign here in Las Vegas. I even attended an all-day rally and got to see her speak live, along with several other important candidates. It was great, although I had a very hard time walking back home that night since I'd been on my feet all day. For the next month, I volunteered at our local chapter of the Democratic headquarters to try to sway undecided voters here in Las Vegas to vote for Harris. Usually joined by friends, I canvassed about 20 neighborhoods, knocking on doors and talking briefly to those who were nice enough to let us in and talk with them, and distributing leaflets to them as well as leaving them in the doors of those who weren't home or chose not to open their doors. I felt it was my duty to do all this, and although sadly Harris ended up losing to Trump, even here in Nevada, I'm still proud of our efforts. Then came that dreadful day, on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. Election Day. Although I've been quite confident that Harris would pull it off. After all, she'd been ahead by a small margin in all the polls the entire time. Much to my horror, Trump won. Not only that, but this time he managed to even win the popular vote. As I've usually done, I watched the election results on TV until about midnight, when it became clear to me that Trump had won, even though the race hadn't yet been called. Sure enough, I learned of the bad news the next morning from my mom. Once Trump was in again, I knew we were in for an even harder time this time. This time, I figured we'd be lucky if we made it through his term. Before Trump even got into office again, things looked grim. He appointed about the worst possible imaginable people to his cabinet, like drunkard Pete Hegseth, who threw an axe over a fence and nearly hit a drummer with it, and Secretary of Defense, and RFK Jr., with a worm in his brain, who'd slaughtered a bear and left its carcass in Central Park and didn't believe in vaccination, as Secretary of Health, not to mention Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, who now decided to ally himself with Trump, despite having allied himself with Obama and Biden beforehand. Although I knew things would go very bad very quickly once Trump got in, I was amazed by how quickly they did and what went wrong. Although nearly all the most important Democrats, including Biden and his family, as well as all the other living ex-presidents, including Clinton and Obama, were kind enough to attend Trump's inauguration, Trump had the audacity to insult Biden on TV just a few feet away from him. The only important Democrat with enough sense not to show up was Michelle Obama, and I applaud her for making this choice. I'll wrap this up with what Trump and his administration have already done during the past 6 months to ruin our country and jeopardize the fate of the entire world. I'd say Trump's first bad action, or rather inaction, as president was to do nothing about the wildfires in Los Angeles, which burnt down several large communities like Pacific Palisades. When the city was finally able to put out the fires, naturally Trump lied and took credit for putting them out himself. After this, his list of atrocities goes on and on. His unreasonably high tariffs resulted in an economic crash, which he needed to alleviate by lowering them again. He fired the director of the FAA and replaced him with one of his cronies, resulting in a record number of commercial airport incidents. He canceled the DOE, put Musk in charge of Doge, and set up El Salvador as our new gulag. To top it all off, he was able to get his big, beautiful bill passed, which will cut essential government programs like Medicaid and food stamps and only favor the rich. Even Musk will become affected by this, which resulted in his resignation, as well as his exposure of Trump's involvement with his former long-term buddy Jeffrey Epstein, which fortunately for now seems to have painted Trump into a corner and split off many of his former MAGA supporters. In conclusion, I'm deeply saddened to see how America, the country I've loved for nearly my entire life, has sunk during most of it and finally resulted in a new low with Trump as its commander and king. We must not allow Trump or any of his cronies to do any more damage to this once wonderful land of ours. We need to stop him before it's too late and restore our democracy, which our founding fathers had created for us, and so many of our ancestors and predecessors fought and toiled so hard to maintain. Long live the USA, and let freedom ring. And that concludes my speech for today, and I always like to end on a positive note. So thank you for watching. Let's make a better world. Let freedom ring. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.